Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're going all the way back to the Vietnam War era.
Yeah, we're diving into some pretty murky waters today.
That's right, we're talking about the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah.
Thousands of pages of top-secret documents.
Yeah, a real bombshell when they were released back in '71.
This wasn't just like some dry historical analysis. This is the inside story of America's involvement in Vietnam.
Absolutely, a behind-the-scenes look at how decisions were made from 1945 right up to 1968.
4 presidencies, a whole lot of history, and maybe a few things they'd rather have kept quiet.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the first things that jumped out at me was how the U.S. government was talking peace publicly but acting very differently in private.
Right, you had the Geneva Accords in 1954, supposed to be this, path to peace for Vietnam.
Right. Partition the country, hold elections for reunification in '56 seemed pretty straightforward.
But the Pentagon Papers show something else entirely going on behind closed doors.
Yeah. The Eisenhower administration thought the Geneva Accords were a disaster, basically handing over Southeast Asia to the communists.
That domino theory, again, the fear that if one country fell to communism, the whole region would follow.
Exactly. And that fear drove a lot of their actions, even if it meant contradicting their public statements.
So they start pouring military aid into South Vietnam, propping up Ngo Dinh Diem as their leader.
Even though they had serious doubts about Diem's, leadership style and his commitment to democracy.
But they needed a strong man to fight the communists, right? So they were willing to overlook some unsavory details.
Exactly. The ends justified the means and all that, and it's a pattern that continues under Kennedy.
He ramps up the U.S. involvement even further, sending more advisors.
And getting involved in all sorts of covert operations against North Vietnam.
This is where we get into some seriously cloak and dagger stuff, like Operation 34A.
Sabotage, propaganda, psychological warfare, all designed to destabilize the North.
And all kept completely secret from the American public.
It's incredible to think that all this was going on while they were talking about seeking a peaceful resolution.
Right. So much for transparency. And then things get even more complicated with the Tonkin Gulf incident.
Ah, yes. August 1964, 2 U.S. Navy destroyers allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats.
This is a major turning point used by the Johnson administration to really escalate the war.
And get that congressional authorization for wider military action, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution.
But the Pentagon Papers show a very different side to this story.
They reveal that the U.S. was engaged in covert operations in the Gulf of Tonkin at the time.
Including those 34A raids we talked about, so not exactly innocent bystanders.
And those details were conveniently left out of the information given to Congress and the public.
So basically, the Johnson administration used a skewed version of events to get their war.
A war that many within the administration had doubts about even as they were escalating it. But that's the story for next time.
That's right. We'll dig deeper into those internal debates and the growing disillusionment within the government in part 2.
And we'll see how all of this leads to the publication of the Pentagon Papers and the huge impact it had on America.
So stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started.
Welcome back to the show.
All right, so last time we left off with the Tonkin Gulf incident.
And how the Johnson administration used it to escalate the war in Vietnam.
Based on some, shall we say, creative interpretations of what actually happened.
And that pattern of secrecy and, well, let's be honest, deception. It didn't stop there.
Yeah, it seems like the deeper you dig into the Pentagon Papers, the more you realize that
there's this whole other story going on behind the scenes, one that the American public wasn't really privy to.
like the fact that there was a lot of internal debate within the Johnson administration.
Not everyone was gung-ho about escalating the war.
You had people like George Ball, the Undersecretary of State.
Yeah, he was warning as early as 1964 that Vietnam was a quagmire.
That the U.S. could get stuck in a war that it couldn't win.
And that a negotiated settlement might be the best option.
But those voices were kind of drowned out by the hawks in the administration.
The people who believed that American military might could prevail.
Right, that the U.S. just needed to show enough force to force North Vietnam to back down.
That was the thinking behind Operation Rolling Thunder.
This massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam starting in early '65.
The goal was to cripple their economy, disrupt their supply lines.
And ultimately force them to the negotiating table.
But if you look at what the Pentagon Papers reveal about the effectiveness of Rolling Thunder, it's
not very encouraging.
No, it's actually pretty shocking. They bombed the heck out of North Vietnam.
But it didn't really achieve its objectives.
The North Vietnamese were incredibly resilient. They adapted. They found ways to keep fighting.
And meanwhile, the civilian casualties were mounting.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of war, even when it's waged from the air.
And all this time, the ground war in South Vietnam is also intensifying.
More and more U.S. combat troops are being sent
From
in.
an advisory role to direct combat involvement,
By 1968, there were over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam.
fighting a brutal and increasingly unpopular war.
And the Pentagon Papers show that the Johnson administration,
They consistently underestimated the enemy's strength and determination.
they thought they could win a quick victory with superior firepower and technology.
But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army,
They were masters of guerrilla warfare. They knew how to fight a war of attrition.
and they were willing to sustain heavy losses, something the U.S. just wasn't prepared for,
So you have this growing disconnect between the administration's optimism
and the reality on the ground.
and then in early 1968 you have the Tet Offensive.
This coordinated attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces across South Vietnam.
It caught the U.S. completely by surprise, and it really shook the American public.
It showed that despite all the bombing, all the troops, the U.S. was nowhere near winning this war.
The Tet Offensive was a turning point in public opinion,
It really shattered the illusion that the war was going well.
and it set the stage for the eventual withdrawal of U.S. forces.
But before we get to that, we need to talk about the publication of the Pentagon Papers.
And the man who risked everything to bring these secrets to light, Daniel Ellsberg,
He was a former Defense Department analyst.
who had worked on the Pentagon Papers study itself.
He'd become disillusioned with the war.
And he believed that the American people had a right to know the truth.
So in 1971, he secretly copied thousands of pages of the study.
And started leaking them to the press, starting with the New York Times.
It was an act of defiance against government secrecy.
And it set off a chain reaction that would have a profound impact on American society. Last time we were talking about Daniel Ellsberg and his decision to leak the Pentagon Papers.
A huge risk, really.
Yeah, I mean, he was facing Espionage Act charges, potentially decades in prison.
But he believed the American people needed to know the truth.
That the cost of secrecy was just too high.
And of course, the Nixon administration, they did not take this lightly.
Oh, absolutely. They went full-on damage control mode.
Tried everything they could to stop the New York Times from publishing.
National security, they claimed, it would irreparably harm the country.
But the Times, they weren't backing down.
And neither were the Washington Post and a bunch of other newspapers that started publishing excerpts.
It became this huge First Amendment battle,
The government versus the press.
with the future of freedom of speech hanging in the balance.
And it all went to the Supreme Court, New York Times coming via United States.
Yeah, one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history.
And the question at the heart of it was,
Could the government censor the press, even if the information was classified?
if there wasn't some immediate threat to national security.
The stakes were incredibly high.
And the court ruled in favor of the New York Times 6-3.
A major victory for freedom of the press.
The justices basically said that the government couldn't use prior restraint to prevent publication.
That the public had a right to know what was going on, even if it was embarrassing to the government.
And what about Ellsberg? What happened to him?
Well, he was charged with Espionage Act violations, theft of government property,
But the charges were eventually dismissed.
due to some pretty serious government misconduct in the case.
It turned out the Nixon administration had been engaged in all sorts of shady stuff.
Like trying to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to discredit him.
Yeah, it was a real mess, and it further eroded public trust in the government.
So the publication of the Pentagon Papers, it had this massive ripple effect.
It fueled the anti-war movement,
It intensified public scrutiny of government actions.
and it really raised questions about the limits of executive power,
It made people realize that the government wasn't always telling the truth.
and that a free press was essential to holding those in power accountable.
You know, it's amazing to think that all this started with one man
Daniel Ellsberg, who was willing to risk everything to expose the truth,
and a group of journalists who were determined to publish it.
even in the face of government pressure.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that someone is trying to keep hidden.
And that a free press is crucial to a functioning democracy.
It's also a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers,
To question official narratives and to seek out multiple perspectives.
especially when it comes to matters of war and peace.
And if you're interested in learning more about the Pentagon Papers,
We highly recommend checking out the book. We have a link in the description.
it's a fascinating read, a real deep dive into this pivotal moment in American history.
And it offers some valuable lessons about the importance of transparency, accountability, and a free press.
Lessons that are just as relevant today as they were back in 1971.
So that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.